This meeting is now being recorded. Good day, and welcome to the Mental Health Transition Panel 1, Reinventing Public Safety. As you will notice, all participants have been muted. If you have any technical issues, please send a chat to all panelists and hosts, the direction of which you can find in the chat window. Thank you for joining, and please welcome Reverend Kristen Miles from Trinity Church Wall Street.
Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for the first panel in the Mental Health and Transition series presented by Fountainhouse in partnership with Trinity Church Wall Street. I'm Reverend Kristen Callback Miles, priest and director for pastoral care and community at Trinity. At Trinity, social justice is one of our core values. Our work aims to break the cycles of mass incarceration, mass homelessness, and housing instability in New York City. We do this through our direct outreach work, our advocacy, speaking in the pulpit and in public, and through our philanthropy. We actively seek to transform our neighborhood by changing systems, organizational structures, and attitudes for racial justice and lasting change. We are so proud to be partnering with Fountainhouse in our work, as the issues I mentioned are almost always intertwined with that of mental illness. On a personal level, our two organizations share a tragedy in the loss of our parishioner and a Fountainhouse member, Deborah Danner, who was killed during a mental health crisis. Deborah was a beloved seeker in all of her communities, and we welcome everyone here today to join us on October 18th, on the 5th anniversary of her passing, for a virtual evening prayer to remember and honor her. Let us now take a quiet moment to gather our hearts and minds together in this space and work. I invite you to close your eyes as you are comfortable, to take 2 deep breaths as we center or pray. May we become aware of the mystery of life in which we all move and breathe. May we connect around what unites us, to move forward, to be the arms that embrace all who struggle and suffer in our community. Amen. I will now welcome Dr. Ashwin Vasan, President and CEO of Fountainhouse.
Thank you so much, Reverend Miles. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Ashwin Vasan, President and CEO of Fountainhouse. Thank you again for joining us for the first panel in our series, Mental Health in Transition, presented by Fountainhouse in partnership with Trinity Church Wall Street. We conceived of this series because New York City is on the cusp of its next chapter as we prepare to elect our new mayor with significant, though short-term, federal relief available to us. And hopefully, as we approach the tail end of this global pandemic, we are pushing the agenda to carve out a bold new vision for a post-pandemic city. Mental health lives and flows through so many aspects of policy and practice in our city. One only has to look at the prominence that issues like closing Rikers, the increase in unhoused populations, lack of social infrastructure were discussed and debated throughout the mayoral race. Unfortunately, embedded within each of these challenges is the myriad ways in which we have left people behind in the process. This is especially true for New Yorkers living with mental illness, and it's time to change that. The rising rates of mental health needs in the wake of the pandemic have simply brought this chronic issue into sharper focus, and we must address it as the public health crisis that it is. Today's panel is entitled Reinventing Public Safety, because we need to fundamentally change our approach to the issue and what sectors and what stakeholders are involved in creating, protecting, and promoting community safety. For my part, I'm a physician and an epidemiologist, and just as health is not merely the absence of illness, safety is not merely the absence of crime. We feel safer when we are approached as human beings, feel connected to others, regarded as people with something to contribute and something to be hopeful for. And yet far too often, people with mental illness are treated with fear and othering and cast into our justice system, just as they were decades ago when we relied upon asylums. The consequences of this are deadly. whether in the mental health toll and trauma that the criminal legal system can create or amplify, or the physical toll it takes on the body in the form of premature illness and shortened lifespans. The way in which we treat people with mental illness with predominantly punitive approaches must fundamentally change. As Reverend Miles mentioned, this month we mark the 5th anniversary of the death of Deborah Danner, a Fountainhouse member and parishioner at Trinity Church Wall Street, whose loss continues to guide our fight for justice and whose death is emblematic of one of the ways we continue to criminalize mental illness with inadequate crisis response solutions. Fountainhouse works at these intersections because we are the people at these intersections and because we represent a fundamental alternative to the status quo. Approximately 40% of our members experience homelessness or unstable housing when they arrive at Fountainhouse. 24% come with a history of incarceration and justice involvement, and 32% join us with a substance use disorder. But we support our members to access stable housing, reduce recidivism, and to go on to achieve their employment, education, and wellness goals. And they do this because of the power of connection and of our community. Today, our members are using the agency and dignity they have reclaimed to become powerful advocates and change makers. My colleague, Fountainhouse member Christina Sperrick, is on the panel today to spotlight her incredible work as just one example. We are so proud that as an organization, we've expanded our programming during the pandemic to create on-ramps, a collection of outreach programs supporting justice-involved individuals and people experiencing homelessness with mental health concerns, and piloting solutions that meet people where they are with dignity, humanity, and respect. These new programs would not have been possible without our partners like Breaking Ground, Times Square Alliance, Midtown Community Court, and the Center for Court Innovation, New York City Parks, the Fort Greene Park Conservancy, just to name a few. We are also deeply grateful to all of our funders, donors, and supporters who continue to invest in this work. Thank you. Today, I'm also incredibly excited that Carolyn Lewis, a health reporter for WNYC and Gothamist, is moderating our first panel. Carolyn has reported on the issue of mental illness and its intersection with the justice system for many years, and her sensitivity to the subject has given an empathetic insight into the experience of countless people harmed by these unjust systems. And I want to thank our panelists, Christina, Liz, Eric, and Susan, for joining us today and sharing your deep insight and for being solutions focused. We know there's a lot of work to do and no one can do this alone. So we're grateful to all the panelists in our series and to our audience members for making these issues a priority. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Ashwin, so much for that introduction. And thank you to Fountainhouse for inviting me to lead this important conversation. I'm joined today by Christina Sperrick, a CPA who has long been a peer mental health advocate. She's part of the group CCIT, Correct Crisis Intervention Today, and has weighed in on police reform and behavioral health initiatives as a member of the Mayor's Crisis Prevention and Response Task Force. Susan Shaw is Managing Director of Racial Justice at Trinity Church Wall Street, which provides grants to a range of programs related to mental health and criminal justice. And she was formerly the Director of Programs and Strategy at the Vera Institute. Elizabeth Glazer is the former Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice and is the founder of Vital City, a new organization dedicated to putting out actionable policy ideas for New York City. Its first report is on closing Rikers. Eric Gonzalez is the Brooklyn District Attorney and has worked in his office to advance initiatives that promote community intervention over police intervention and help divert people away from the criminal justice system. So both the city and advocates in recent years have been grappling with this question of who should intervene when someone's having a mental health crisis and how they should intervene. Obviously, for a long time, that's primarily been the police, and that can be people's first point of contact with the criminal justice system. And as we've seen, those encounters can sometimes turn deadly. So I want to start by turning to Christina. You developed something called person-centered crisis intervention, along with a program to do outreach in Fort Greene Park. Can you tell us a bit about what that looks like and why you wanted to develop your own program after working on city initiatives?
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for having me today. In a partnership with Fountainhouse, Forkling Park Conservancy, and the New York City Parks Department, I created a person-centered intervention training program to train social well-being team, which consists of peers, those with lived experience, such as myself, with mental health or substance use disorder, homelessness, or those who are justice involved, and Fort Greene Park staff to respectfully engage with all people when they're well, becoming unwell, or in crisis. We spend too much time focused on crisis, so it was important to me to focus on prevention and intervention as well, just meeting people where they're at any stage of the spectrum of wellness. What makes my program so unique, it's a non-police response program, is that the program was taught by peers. So it was a bottom-up approach of teaching, and it was taught by peers and friends and families who have been directly impacted by those with lived experience. Peers were selected as instructors because those are the closest to the problems. Those who are closest to the problems are closest to the solution. And to add, peers should control their own narrative. Too often, others are controlling our own narrative, telling us that we're dangerous and all these negative things, but I think we should have the power and embrace it. And as we say in our community, nothing about us without us. The four main goals of Pcit, by the way, of using the social well-being team, which consisted of two peers touring the park 5 days a week in the morning and the evening, was one, to divert people from the criminal legal system, two, to connect people to services, three, to build authentic, meaningful relationships and supports, and four, give people a sense of belonging in Fort Greene Park and in the community. To quickly answer the need, why I needed to develop this, is that in New York City, police have long contributed to the problems, escalating situations in many instances that could have been diffused. Police are trained to respond to criminals and not to people in mental health conditions. And the police crisis intervention training, which teaches on mental health, they teach that people living with mental health concerns are EDPs, emotionally disturbed people. We are not people. I have an issue with that. I'm a person first, and do not come to me or any people in my community as an emotionally disturbed person. When you teach people that us versus them, it breeds resentment, bias towards people living with mental health conditions. To add, police are not taught to deal with their own trauma. Many of them live with PTSD, alcoholism, and in fact, 2019, it was reported that 228 police officers died by suicide. So mental illness does not discriminate. So let's get it clear. It doesn't discriminate. Everyone can live with it.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. And so next I want to ask DA Gonzalez about initiatives that your office has worked on. I know that you have been involved in community-based alternatives to policing. So at what point does the DA's office typically come into contact with people with mental illness, and how are you working to change that dynamic?
Good morning, Caroline. And I just want to say hello to my fellow panelists, Christina, Liz, and Susan. Thank you. This is an important topic, and I'm so grateful that we're spotlighting this today to continue this conversation. You know, in terms of our public servants and our law enforcement community, which I'm a part of, we do not put enough focus in on the appropriate ways to think about, speak about, and to handle mental illness and people in crisis in our city. And so, quite frankly, almost every case that I'm involved in starts out with a law enforcement response. Typically, people who come in with mental health challenges and illness are either victims of crime. We also often think of them as perpetrators of crime, but they're often victims of crime. And sometimes they come in as, the accused. And so it is, it's a continuous flow of people who come into the district attorney's office who may have mental health challenges and illness. And so the way we think about it and the way we speak about it is important. But unfortunately, as Christina mentioned, it starts often with a police response. And so, we have a lot of things that we're working on in the office to change that. I should say that one of the interesting things that came out of bail reform is that a number of people who would normally have long criminal records, they've cycled in and out of the criminal justice system, and often would wind up at arraignments and have bail set on them. We now see them coming in either in desk appearance tickets, or we see them come in where the case is not bail eligible. It really does allow us to be more thoughtful and creative about how we handle those cases. In my office, we try to divert as many misdemeanors as possible. We also try to deflect cases. And what I mean by that is on these desk appearance tickets, we try not to wait before the person has to come to court and be arraigned, but working with peer counselors and others to reach out, try to get services early, make the connections to deal with people's whatever social service issues and mental health issues they have, deal with that, and then send them off to community-based partners. And if we can do that, then the case never has to come to court. I could decline to prosecute it in preventing that additional trauma of being justice involved and being before our courts. So that's one way we deal with it. We deal with that similarly in a non-harm reduction model with our Brooklyn Clear, which deals often with substance use disorder and issues of mental illness, using peer counselors to reach out to the person and try to get them to services before they ever have to come to court. Of course, for more serious cases where people come in on charge with significant felonies, Brooklyn is blessed to have a mental health court that is innovative. It has, a psychologist and a psychiatrist on staff, social workers, and really does significant work to try to treat the mental illness and the legal issue in ways that restores people and not necessarily looks to criminalize them. So I'm proud of what we're doing in that way, but we need to do a lot more. And this is such an important conversation for all of those reasons. And then I hope that at some point Liz or Susan will talk about, what we would like to do with creating these hubs in places like in Brownsville, which I think could be groundbreaking for how we deal with these issues.
Right. Well, someone asked in the chat, why don't we just not arrest people in the first place? And the next thing I was going to bring up was the Brownsville Safety Alliance, which seeks to take police out of the equation by partnering with community groups. I know there was like a week without police where there would be an area where police were not intervening, and instead there were Sorry, I was muted. Okay, let me start over. So I was saying in the chat, someone mentioned, why don't we just not arrest people to begin with? I know that you're involved with something called the Brownsville Safety Alliance, where it has sought to take police out of the equation by having like a week without police, having community intervention instead, having violence interrupters in a certain area. So I'm wondering, if you can talk a bit about that, and have you faced a lot of support for that? Have you faced skepticism? Were you at all skeptical about it? DA Gonzalez.
Sure. Thank you for raising that. I mean, part of that goal is to allow, impacted communities to decide and lead on issues of safety and fairness, and think about a non-police led response to crime. And it's exciting. And I've been a prosecutor for a long time. My office is a partner with the other organizations that are part of this Brownsville Safety Alliance, and really saying to our communities, you're the stakeholders here. You help us decide how to move forward on these cases. And so imagine having the ability to think about moving towards a fairer system that doesn't look at punishment as the central principles behind accountability, but really moving towards a public health model. And I think this is all of a step. But the Brownsville Safety Alliance, uses local community stakeholders, our violence interrupters, our CMS folks, Maimonides is part of it, my office, and a lot of other community organizations, the city, providing community-based organizations. And the police have agreed to kind of step back and allow us to work on issues that could be resolved without arrest. And to your point, it allows for different responses to cases that don't equate to arrest. And we've had some examples where things would have led to an arrest, but the Alliance has stepped in, has provided resources, have connected people together. And I should say this, that, you know, my thinking as the DA on this is that long-term connections between people will help lead us to a safer place. You know, often what happens for our justice system, someone comes in, gets some services, and then the court mandate is over, and then they leave, and then, you know, eventually those connections don't remain. And so having our community partners really there on the ground, leading it, and continuously staying in contact, providing connections, providing a positive role model and positive interactions, I think will take us a long way. But this safety hub is also an idea that comes out of that, and which is, could we have a place where all of our community-based organizations and the city and our city organizations can be in a place when someone comes in? Could the police bring someone there, as opposed to bringing them to the precinct and charging them? Could they bring them there to get services, to connect them? And could the DA's office monitor, but not be the primary actors in charging cases? And so it's really exciting stuff. I encourage everyone to take a real good look at what's come out of the Brownsville Safety Alliance. You know, there's been a lot of early success there. I should say that, you know, as district attorney, I don't view it as anti-police. To your question about, Caroline, your question about criticisms or skepticism, yeah, sure, there's some people who would, be critical of that sort of approach. But I would say this, you know, in the 7th-3 precinct where this is happening, the police department has been a tremendous partner in understanding. And I think that there's a movement afoot among police chiefs and leaders across this country that the police are not the best first responders in a lot of these cases. And what's happening in Brownsville is an example of how our community can lead towards public safety and ultimately public health.
Thank you for that. And Susan, I know that you work to fund a lot of initiatives across the city that are working on these issues. And of course, if we're taking police out of the equation, we need to put something else in. So, you know, what are sort of the biggest gaps you see in promoting public health and mental health and public safety? And how can we fill those gaps?
Sure, and very happy to be here with this wonderful group of real thinkers and doers, which is really important. Well, I'd like to first talk about public dollars. So if we really want to have a viable community-based infrastructure that is responsible for public safety, we need to be allocating funding that's really commensurate to what the cost is of running a police precinct in a particular neighborhood. You know, this is something that Liz and her colleague, Dr. Pat Sharkey, have really fleshed out. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And in New York City, we are really far from this. The money is concentrated in criminal justice agencies who only are able to punish and isolate. And philanthropy has a role too. You know, we see our dollars being helpful to enable organizations to tee up new initiatives so that they can operate and demonstrate results and communicate their results and then be ready for significantly more funding from government. We can also fill gaps that exist when initiatives are funded by government so that these programs can be nimble and they can respond to the dynamic nature of public safety. You know, as a funder and an advocate, I'm really excited about the development that we're seeing with community violence interrupter programs, community action teams, projects like the Brownsville Safety Alliance, which DA Gonzalez talked about. And what we know is that these initiatives that are really locally rooted are responding to people who are experiencing mental health crises, and also responding to them, in times where there can be prevention of a crisis. They use credible messengers, peers, people with lived experience. And so that's really great. And, we're funding a number of these programs, and I hope that, we can help tee them up to be scaled within New York City. And also, Fountainhouse's Clubhouse model, where they're able to provide that community and the source of support, and then additional services like supportive housing, super important. And I know that Fountainhouse is part of this citywide network of clubhouses. And in fact, I think it's even a global network, but they need to be fully resourced and really resourced around outreach. I think outreach is really, really important, as we heard Christina talk about and Dr. Vassan. And then I'd like to just echo what DA Gonzalez said about the public health framework. If we're going to be thinking about how our public safety dollars are spent, it makes sense to approach this with the public health framework. We should not just be coming in at the end after a crisis or is happening and just funding the enforcement and response. We need to be thinking about this a lot more holistically, and thinking about prevention and thinking about what keeps communities healthy and safe. This means focusing on vulnerable or at-risk individuals, harm reduction. And it also includes systems reform and, always with an eye of strengthening the community. So I think a public health framework should guide all of our public safety policies and the city budget.
Absolutely. And that sort of leads into my next question for Liz, who was part of this administration. What role in an ideal world should government play in, increasing the impact of these sort of community-based programs that might vary from neighborhood to neighborhood? And how can the government help create sort of a more cohesive vision for mental health and public safety? You're muted.
Sorry, you would think that 2 years of Zoom, you would learn how to do this, but no. So I just wanted to go back to something that Eric said, because I think it is absolutely foundational to everything, which is the absolutely central shift that we have to make. And I think government has an important role in doing that for reasons I'll sort of lay out in a bit, is to move our reflex from thinking that the only way to create safety, or the most effective way to create safety, is more police and more jail, to a mindset in which we understand that safety actually starts from building a thriving life for all of us. And that force, which is really what lies behind the criminal justice system, must be the last resort. And, this is what the Kerner Commission said decades and decades ago. It's what we've learned from research over and over again, that access to education, decent schools, parks, all these other things is what makes us safe. And it sounds very sort of lofty and highfalutin, but it's quite concrete. And maybe we'll talk about that later, but because I do think it's central, and I think Eric is exactly right. And that's why I think what is happening in Brownsville, the Brownsville Safety Alliance, is so exciting, because it represents that shift, but it needs to be amplified. It's something potentially the government should be able to try to do. And so, I would say that government can and should do a ton. It exists by, with, and for the people. It exists to provide services. It can be a force for good and should be. It is the arterial structure to deliver funding and services, because, who else has a recurring budget of this size? Not foundations, not really any other entity. The city of New York now has $100 billion that it spends every year, and how it decides to spend it and coordinate it is a matter of policy. And it exists with services in every single neighborhood, whether clinics and hospitals or jobs programs or community centers. And most importantly, it has the ability to spread learning. So it funds, as Susan was saying, like, there are a gazillion nonprofits that are, and Christina was sort of describing this, and Eric was describing this, that are doing absolutely crucial work. But how do we learn from all the great stuff that's happening out there? And how do we nimbly figure out this is really great and can be amplified and spread quickly? And so I would say, what stands in the way of government being that force for good in a really effective way? I would say that there's really no one person in the justice sphere that has the authority and the responsibility to pull it all together in a consistent and regular way, and to help support and replicate all these great ideas. And I've advocated in various places that we have, a deputy mayor for justice policy and operations who could pull these things together, who could speak as an equal to the other deputy mayors and to the budget director. It's crazy when you think about it that we have these deputy mayors for, it's good, but we have deputy mayors for, housing and health and human services. But in the one area where the right to take life is conferred upon an agency, where truly it's a matter of like life and death, we don't have a coordinating agency. And I don't know if I have time to just give two quick examples specifically of like how this could work, particularly in the mental health. So signal me if I can or can't, but yes, okay, cool. So I just wanted to sort of give these two quick examples. Like, we have all these systems, each system has its issues, right? The healthcare system is, everybody has its issues, and the intersection is like cruddy, right? And we see this particularly, for example, in people who suffer from mental health challenges and also touch the shelter and jail systems. And Eric talked about this a little bit. And usually what's going on is when they hit the criminal justice system, it's for low-level, cruddy stuff, often related to the fact that they may be homeless or whatever, so they're trespassing, in a housing development stairwell or whatever it may be. And so these folks, like in the course of a year, they can have 21 incarcerations, all really short, like 10 days at a time. They bounce between the shelter and jail systems. It costs about $130 million in jail and health costs compared to like 32 million for other people. But we actually know what to do. Like, we have incredibly good evidence about what supportive housing does to help people stabilize and not be tick-tocking through. But we're not doing it at scale. We're not doing it with discipline. We're not doing it with focus. And the second example I'll just give is, we do have some evidence of what happens when you have both the political will and steady concentration and have everybody pulling together. So what happened at the beginning of COVID when we were so confronted with the matter of life and death in the jails, all of these different decision makers, and Eric was an incredibly important part of this as the other DAs were in the courts, sat down and figured out who of the 5,000 people in jail really, really need to be there as a matter of life and death. And within 6 weeks, the population dropped by a third. Now, that's something that should be happening every single day before people get into jail, not wait for a crisis. Anyway, so.
Good point. And I think there were a lot of good points made about like how the city's, the bulk of city funding and attention doesn't necessarily go to these issues, even if, they're paid lip service sometimes or get some money, it's not a police budget. So this sort of question is sort of for whoever wants to answer, but how does this effort to change the way we look at mental health and public safety relate to these broader movements we've seen, for defunding the police, for Black Lives Matter, and these are also obviously movements that specifically center Black lives. But anyone who wants to sort of weigh in on that.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, it's clear that all of the above and all of the movements have really opened our eyes and really, the eyes of many Americans and clearly many New Yorkers about the appropriate relationship between communities and law enforcement communities and what we want from our policing and where we could do something better. And it's also shined light on things that we kind of know about, but maybe ordinary New Yorkers don't know, that there are people in Rikers, that Rikers is the #1, mental health facility in the city. And that's absurd and wrong. And so it really gives us an opportunity to do some self-reflection and hopefully a sustained movement towards changing and having those change agents that I think Susan talked about, but just kind of really, just opened, the conversation so that, even people who were staunchly, in support of law enforcement understands that we do need to re-examine what's happening in the way we're approaching it. And I think, to me, one of the things that I see in the communities that I'm in, and I'm talking about my professional communities, is that there are chiefs of the police departments across America who now will publicly say, yes, we should have mental health professionals and peer counselors respond first, or at least in coordination. And I think that it's part of a process, but it's really part of this process that I talked about, which is a transition from, the force and the power of government towards more community-led safety.
I like to jump in as well. Thanks for saying that, D.S. Gonzalez, that police are open across the country to having peers involved in mental health professionals. Also, I want to add to your comment, Liz, is that I know you mentioned about government can be a force of good, but I think in addition to that, I think peers, in order for the government to be a force of good, they need to have peers as part of the conversation and be part of the decision-making process. So if the government would just reach out to the community members, community organization and peers, things would be different and better for the community. Peers, we navigated through many systems. We know what works. We know what doesn't work well. Caroline, to your question, to answer that, mental health intersects with racial and social injustice. We cannot have a conversation about mental health until we look at how the entire community is affected and about the disparities in access to culturally competent and trauma-informed care. Communities of colors are plagued with poverty and gun violence, and as we know, gun violence is a public health issue. And to add, communities of colors are afraid to call the police for fear of being harmed and killed.
Caroline, I'd like to just quickly add, a note of optimism, I think. I think it's great that we are at a point now, as DA Gonzalez said, that, and I've seen this too, where we all really understand the need to have EMTs and trained mental health professionals be the ones that are the first responders when someone is having a mental health crisis. And I really hope that this can be the beginning for us to really look at, what else is police being called on to be the first responder for, that, a community-based response would be stronger. I mean, one thing that we know from 911 data all across the country and also in New York City is that only 25% of the calls for service that police respond to are for crimes in progress. So, there's 75% of what they are responding to that is not a crime right now that is happening, but their only tool is an arrest, which lands someone in jail. And so, I really hope that we can learn from what we are doing in New York City with the Be Heard pilot, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and really use that as an opportunity to really look at other situations as well.
I'm glad sorry, go ahead, Liz.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what Susan said. I think the flip side of, the 25% number is we also see, particularly in New York City, this huge accretion of civic and civilian responsibilities by the police department So they're funded now to run community centers, to do employment programs, to do graffiti cleanup, to do a whole array of things that I think we would most normally think of as nonprofit or civilian government functions or family functions. And I think that it speaks to, again, this issue that I think Eric raised, and then I think is absolutely fundamental, which is our reflex is to, and our default is to call the police for all these different things. And frankly, they don't want to be called for a lot of these things. And it's partly because I think because the police are visible, they're instantly deployable. It feels like you're dealing with an issue, even though to Christina's point, you know, there are harms that come with that as well. And I think that especially as we see sort of violent spike as we have, you know, during the pandemic, it's going to take a lot to pull back from that reflex. And one of the most important things that it will take is to show that there is something else, you know, what Eric's building, Be Heard, something that is not police, but is flexible, civilian, comes from the neighborhood, does not use force, you know, and absolutely take Christina's point about peers. And frankly, whether you call them peers or family members or neighbors, that notion of just, you know, we're living together in a common enterprise, you know, and that should, informal connection and support should be the first way that we build safety. But I think that that we need to be able to show what the options are that are not police, and we need to figure out a way to talk about it in an affirmative way, like to not say, you know, what can we do instead of the police? What is an alternative? Like that's not the right language. It should be the primary. The primary function is the building of the civilian.
Right. So I'm glad that you guys are bringing up Be Heard. You know, this is a program that the city has finally launched where a team of EMTs and social workers can respond to mental health crisis calls coming into 911 instead of the police. And, you know, it was piloted, it's being scaled up across the city. I'm going to ask everyone sort of some thoughts about it, but actually, since Liz, you were just talking, I want to ask, you know, why did it take 7 years from the time the mayor started talking about, you know, public safety and mental health when he, you know, first began his tenure to actually launch this type of pilot that takes police out of the equation? Like there were many other mobile teams that sort of like didn't really have the ability to be first responders or involved police or weren't really implemented because they didn't really want them to respond to calls. Like, why did it take so long to really get something like this off the ground? Oh, sorry. You're muted.
I think it's really complicated, and I think everybody on this panel has like knowledge and insight as to why it is. I mean, I would sort of boil it down to two things. There are some good reasons and some not good reasons. I think the good reasons are that we learn things. Like I think back to 2014, when the city put together this behavioral health task force, and I think, Eric, you were on it. It was like 400 different entities, people with lived experience, to government, to nonprofits, to everybody, to try and figure out how to stop the number of people who suffer from mental illness coming into jail, to reduce the amount of time they stay if they're there, and to make transition better when they leave. And it was a lot of good things came out of it that we do today, right? So, we got funding for supportive housing. It resulted in funding for these alternatives for judges, aside from jail, that contributed to about a 40% of what the reduction in the jail population was. There was, for the first time, mental health training for police, and it was considered so extraordinary that it was front page news in the New York Times. But what wasn't there? What wasn't there was what we're talking about right now, which is, why aren't civilians responding instead? And I'm sure, probably cahoots already existed. I'm sure all these ideas existed, but it wasn't front of mind to the 400 groups most deeply engaged in this, or at least didn't rise up to that. So, I think that's maybe a good reason, and one reason why we need to accelerate learning. And I think there are also really bad reasons, which, maybe kind of crudely put, are just politics, which is people are concerned, elected officials are concerned about what the blowback will be when something like a response to an incident that could turn deadly is changed. And who will be blamed, and how do we avoid it? There are good reasons too, right? We want to have as few deadly incidents as possible. But and I think that's still an issue, even though we're where we are, meaning, can civilian response withstand the first bad incident? And how do we build enough support for this, for it to withstand a bad incident?
I think that's a great point, because of course, police response withstands bad incidents all the time. But so I'm curious, I know that Christina, CCIT has had some criticism of this program be heard. I'm curious what everyone thinks, whether you guys are optimistic about it, what you're interested to see from it, but maybe Christina, we can start with you.
So yes, CCIT, we're a non-police advocacy organization that advocates for non-police response to mental health calls. We have some critiques about the program. First, the development, the planning and implementation of the program was only done by city agencies. There was no input or feedback or suggestions from the community or peers themselves. We were not at the table. Also, the response time as part of this program is up to 30 minutes. And when you think about other medical or other emergencies, they can respond up to 8 to 12 minutes. So it's like if a person's in crisis, by the time you get to 30 minutes, it's already escalated. And then by that time, people want to call the police. Why can't we work on having a shorter response time? Also, it was, I believe, it's social workers that are hired, and EMT or fire department. But where was the peers? Why weren't peers hired? Why weren't peers hired? We speak the language, we think, walk, and talk like our community. We know how to de-escalate. We've been there. We know what recovery looks like. We know what crisis looks like. Also, responding by clinicians responding to every incident, they use more of a clinical model, which is more like diagnosis, medication, and stabilization. People in the community, we want people to actually talk to us and respect us and treat us with dignity and respect. We don't really want the clinical approach. We really want peers more involved in the crisis response. And that's basically the top 3 issues that we have. And also, lastly, I'm on the advisory committee, and we had our first meeting maybe 2 months ago, and it was supposed to be every single month. We haven't had a meeting in 2 months. So I don't know what the data is now. I don't know what's out there. I don't know the outcomes right now.
Thank you. DA Gonzalez, what are you looking for from this program? What are you sort of keeping track of it? Are you optimistic about it?
So I am optimistic, and I hope it's framed appropriately in terms of what we're looking for. often I've seen, in my years as a district attorney, that we've lost people whose parents or loved ones have called 911 for a response for someone who's been suffering from some kind of episode in the home, and without the ability to really de-escalate and safely get the person out of the house. We've had situations where civilians have been killed by the police, yet they've called 911 for help, and now they're dead or injured. And so, I hope a few things. I mean, I hope that this expands and continues, so that we have these resources coming out quickly, the peers and medical professionals. But I hope we don't limit it only to these cases where we're saying there's no threat of violence, because then there'll be, in many of the cases, by the time a loved one is calling the police, there is some threat of violence. And I know that immediately when you call 911, they want to know if there's a weapon involved. They want to know things. And if we have such a limited response, and to Liz's political point, if the police are going to take the lead in every case where a person is acting, dangerously or with a weapon, we'll have limited success. And so I think it's so important that we have a broader approach to when this comes, and maybe thinking about a different number. Like, I grew up, there was not 311. I think people have learned that there's 311 now. Maybe there could be some other approach to how we get a response for when people are calling, when a victim, a concerned loved one is calling. They are not really calling the police for their own safety. Often they're actually calling for the safety of the person who is going through the crisis. And so there should be a different way of approaching it. And I just, have heard some concerning thoughts that, some 911 operator will make the decision on who to send. And, that's probably not the best way of approaching it.
Oh, I'd like to add something.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I forgot to mention the program, the Be Heard program, if I recall, is only 16 hours a day, right? And so people automatically assume that, when people are unwell, we can only be sick for 16 hours a day. No, it doesn't happen that way. So so automatically default is after the 16 hours, the call goes to 911. And so there will automatically be a police response. We need a 24/7 day a week, 365 day a year response, a mental health response.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Christina. I just wanted to lift up, something that DA Gonzalez talked about, and that was about 911. So, it's, I hope that through this pilot, and that all of us really look at 911 and how that infrastructure exists, because, what I've learned is that, in New York City, these, radio dispatchers, they're housed in the NYPD comm section, and their starting salaries are like 39 to 45,000, and the maximum salary is 53,000. So these are like entry level positions. People do not stick around. There is not like an expertise that exists. And these are individuals who are really making that first call, right? Of like, who's going to respond to this? And so, and now there's 988. Which, DA Gonzalez, I don't know if you know about. I was shocked that I, didn't know more about it, because this is an actual like crisis hotline that's going to be implemented this summer across the country. And, I know that CCIT has actually been doing a lot of advocacy around this, but it's amazing how, none of us are really looped in, and especially, peers and people with lived experience, because these are two things that can really either get in the way of a reform or can actually make something, deliver the way that we want it to.
Absolutely. And so, DA Gonzalez, I'm glad that you brought up the issue of violence. There's this dichotomy between violent and nonviolent that I want to explore a little bit. When it comes to, people being apprehended by the police when they're in mental health crisis, like often the police say they had a weapon, like Deborah Danner had a bat. Other people have, had knives. And so Christina, you've talked about peers being involved. Like, how would a peer respond differently than police in like a really difficult situation like that, where some people might say like, oh, the police have to go in because there's a weapon or something?
My response is like, I know we have violence interrupters, and we can have violence interrupters be contacted to before police are contacted. So I think it's better to work in the community and see what the community supports are available to use a violent interrupter. And some peers can be trained to use those techniques as well.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on sort of like where we draw that line, in terms of police being involved, and how maybe we can like reframe what appears to be a violent situation, especially if someone has something considered a weapon?
I mean, I was thinking, there's that tragic case in 2018 of Saheed Vasan. And he was somebody who was well known in the neighborhood. He suffered from mental illness. And his sort of neighbors said he's harmless, but he's walking around the street with a pipe and kind of pointing it at people as if it's a gun. And the police are called, and what ends up happening is sort of like just tragic. The way it's described by people on the street is, one guy says it looked like a hit. That is, the police sort of rushed in, and in a very short period of time, he was killed by gunfire. And it really sort of, I think it was one of the things that was a motivator for, the crisis working group that I think maybe Christina, you were on, or, that started to think about how do we decide what's violent and not? Because here's somebody who neighbors knew, family knew, shopkeepers knew. He was killed right around the corner from his house. But to a 911 operator, he looked violent because he maybe was holding a gun. So the cops are called, but actually not even the cops from the precinct, who apparently also knew him and potentially could have de-escalated. So, that may not be helpful because it further sort of complicates how do you decide who you send and when you send them. But at least to me, it signals that our default should be civilians go, and that is not our default now.
I would like to add, I'm sorry. So for an example, I know somebody in my community for like 22 years, and he committed murder and served 25 years, came back out and committed murder again. But he and I have a relationship, right? Because I'm not judging him at all. I treat him as a person. I see him all the time. And so like, if he's unwell, I know how to de-escalate because we already built that rapport. And I also know his mother, and I know another woman in the community that he fears. So I could always go to them for support. So I think it's best to keep it in the community by getting to know people, because then it's like having that relationship, you build that trust. If we didn't have that trust, he wouldn't listen to me, and he would end up back into the criminal legal system.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because like this model was sort of modeled off of Cahoots, which started in Eugene, Oregon, and people think of it as like, oh, taking police out of the equation, but I think there's still a lot of communication in that program between police and these like community-based teams. Like, I don't know if maybe DA Gonzalez or someone else has any insight into this, but like, is there communication between police and these like alternatives? Is there enough communication? Are they collaborating? Like,
So part of it is just our approach. And, in some of these other jurisdictions, when police do respond, and so they're there to make sure a peer is safe or an EMT is safe, they're not dressed in uniform. Often they have like a white, polo shirt and khaki pants, and they don't have their gun, showing, and they're there to actually de-escalate. And, to Liz's, the case that Liz talked about was a tragic case. that was a split-second judgment call by police officers. They thought he had a gun. He did not. He had an L-shaped pipe. But in a lot of the other cases that I've seen, it's a loved one who's called the police. And I've always just said, but why can't you just take the mother, the sister, whoever called the police, the wife, out of the apartment and secure the apartment, right? And why do you have to, at that point, have that law enforcement response? Like, you either drop the knife, the bat, the spoon, whatever it turned out to be, or there's going to be the use of force. And that's, I think, the de-escalation problems that the police have been training on, but because they're not the right people to respond to that. And so, these models exist in other places. And we just need to take the best. And Liz talked about the learning has to continue. But for us to continue moving forward, we can't have a mental health response system that operates 16 hours a day, because we know people are in crisis 24 hours a day. So we have to learn, we have to push. And, I don't know what time we're going into, but I'm really grateful for this conversation, right? Because I am a stakeholder in this, and I learned from my colleagues and from, I've been responding to questions on the chat and on the Q&A. This is how we move forward. And I'm committing my office to being a better partner in this work. And so thank all of you. I'm about to sign off because I actually have something going on in court. But this is the process. And so, Caroline, I think it's so important that as we have a new mayor coming in, that the advocates and people like Susan and Liz and Christina really, extract commitments now for what we're going to do, with this new administration, because we've done de-escalation training. We'll continue to do that. We'll continue to do those things, but we need different solutions. And at the end of all of this, and this is just my philosophical opinion, even the conversation treats people with mental illness with a stigma, and and once you get them criminally justice involved, that stigma even grows more, because now they're often viewed, if the police have to come and use force, they're considered to be mentally ill and dangerous. And so having responses that don't look like law enforcement responses are one of the best things we can do for the health of our community. And I'll share something I think I might have said to Liz once, but when I was a child and I was young, probably 10 years old, 8 years old, I had an uncle who's now deceased, who had a schizophrenic episode in his house. His wife called the police, and he was cowering in his bedroom. He had a hammer, and his wife called the police. Police responded. He wouldn't drop the hammer. They shot him. He survived the shooting. Those are the kind of actions that really create distrust in our communities, right? Because I will tell you that my family forever and ever thought that if he was wealthy and white, he would have not been shot in his own apartment, when all they needed to do was give him some time and space. But that's what happened in my own family. So these are not isolated incidents, and many people in our communities know that when you're calling 911, you're possibly risking the health of the person you're actually trying to help. And so that system has to change. But I do apologize. The judge is asking for me in court on an issue. So I'll see everyone soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your insights. I want to turn to audience questions soon, but first I just want to ask everyone on the panel, what are you expecting from the next mayor or hoping for from the next mayor in terms of how they prioritize mental health and public safety, and what do you think they can improve upon from the de Blasio administration? Susan, do you want to start?
Sure. it was so great to have DA Gonzalez on. I mean, I think it just, it just shows that there's just some amazing folks who are on the inside that we should really be working with because they are totally aligned with us. I think that obviously, expanding the Be Heard pilot and, adding the, necessary kind of improvements that Christina talked about of having peers really inform how it works, how it's expanded. We do really need to understand and improve the way 911 response happens and integrate 988. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on the chat about that, which is great. We also need to get everyone off of Rikers who is there because of a serious mental illness. We at 20% of the population at Rikers has been categorized as having a serious mental illness, and about half actually are receiving mental health services. So we need to get them off. Liz, has put out a really great report with a plan that includes increasing therapeutic beds. All of that makes perfect sense, and we really need to prioritize that. The other thing I'll say is that in all of our schools, like public schools need to have on-site or ready access to mental health supports. The number of social workers needs to be increased. Teachers need someone to refer students to. We really know that the pandemic is impacting all of us and definitely students, young people. And so, that's the other thing I would prioritize. And then the final thing I would say is, I think citywide, we need to acknowledge the pain and the need for healing that we all really need to have as a result of this pandemic, the continuing pandemic, the losses that we've experienced, the lack of social interaction, all of that. And so there needs to be spaces all around the city that are that welcome individuals to be in community and to heal and to be at peace. Public spaces are very limited for everybody, especially if someone does have justice system involvement or has been in touch with law enforcement because of mental health or other issues. And we need to really expand that as well.
Christina, do you want to answer that as well?
Yes, thank you. So I'm grateful that de Blasio used the mental health as his platform because it definitely brought awareness to mental health. But I believe that he could have done better by hiring peers in leadership roles to serve as his advisors and speak to the needs of the mental health community. For the next administration, I think for us to change how people view mental health, we need to normalize mental health, place more emphasis on prevention and intervention and not crisis, and treat mental health as a public health issue. One of the first steps the mayor can do is visit Fountainhouse and other clubhouses throughout the city to learn more about the model itself and why it works. I'll learn more about the strengths of its members and what community and recovery looks like and what supports Fountainhouse offers to those to thrive. Additional improvements can be change the EDP language in the patrol guide to person in crisis because we are people first. Definitely establish a New York CCIT peer-driven mental health response model, establish mental health programs in schools, just like Susan Shaw said, and definitely hire like staff peer counselors in the schools of a diverse group of people. Definitely definitely LGBTQ people as well as peers too. Have 24/7 mental health clinics like City MDs on every corner, like Starbucks. We need to no longer have health deserts like in Brownsville where there's no clinics at all. It's just liquor stores on every corner. We need to have more respite centers throughout the borough because that's people need to have respites as an alternative to hospitalization. And we need to convert all these brand new luxury buildings into affordable and supportive housing so people can live.
Thank you. Liz, if you have an answer.
It really just very brief. We have a ton of money, and we have amazing knowledge and experience and resources. All the people on this panel, all the people who are in the audience. New York has an embarrassment of riches. We don't seem to have the will or the ability to pull it all together in a coordinated and disciplined way. And that goes for everything from, as Susan said, reducing the Rikers population, to figuring out whether it will always be police first or civilians first. I mean, that's a very crude way of saying it. And I think that that's the missing ingredient. We need to have somebody who wakes up with a stomachache every single day, thinking and doing just this, connecting with every single person and entity in the city who is engaged in this issue.
Thank you guys so much. This has been an awesome panel, and I want to acknowledge that Dr. Vasan has joined us for the Q&A portion. So I understand we have some audience questions, and we're going to select some of those now.
Thank you. Our first question, everything discussed so far excludes diversion solutions for people with serious mental illnesses who also lack insight they're sick. Sadly, sometimes contact with the criminal justice system is the only way people are handcuffed to help. But what treatment and care options are there? How do we support people who have the lack of insight?
Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I can talk a little bit from my experience as a clinician, as well as someone who runs a community-based mental health nonprofit. It's a really challenging issue. Getting someone to make a choice for themselves in the face of disease or diseases that interfere with their ability to make choices for themselves, clear choices for themselves. And what I refuse to believe, though, is that then the result must be carceral or institutional or coercive or mandated in such a way that we don't actually begin to address the nature of those symptoms in ways where folks can begin the process of stabilization and eventually recovery. Putting someone, I think we all know the largest mental health treatment facilities in the country are jails and prisons, Rikers Island, Cook County Jail, and LA County. The percentage of our population that is institutionalized is actually relatively constant, has been relatively constant over decades. The difference being that as we close down mental health institutions, we trans-institutionalize them to our jail and prison system. And so I refuse to believe that even in the face of lack of insight, anaxognosia, as they say in Latin, that we must bring a punitive system to bear on people's lives. What is it that is stopping us from building even an institutional mental health system that is humane? What is stopping us from building mental health hospitals that are humane? What are the financial incentives that are allowing our private hospital systems to close psychiatric beds year on year on year? So I refuse and I reject the idea that police, our criminal legal system, and our correctional institutions are the places where those decisions have to be made. I work every day with compassionate psychiatrists and social workers and psychologists who deal with the most difficult to treat. The idea that Fountainhouse is caring for people who are, feeling unwell is just not true. The folks we care for and who recover are suffering, and a lot of them lack insight. But how are we able to foundationally redirect their trajectories? Is it because the criminal justice system gets them, stabilizes them, and sends them to us? Absolutely not. In fact, often we receive them in worse shape than when they arrived in the criminal legal system, if they do come to us from there. It is because we keep coming back with solutions. We keep coming back with opportunities. We keep coming back with engagement, and we don't quit. We lead with peers. We lead with social workers. We lead with whatever it takes to keep people connected and visible and to prevent them from falling into the extreme isolation that will eventually lead to crisis and connection or contact with what is currently a police first mental health crisis response system. And so we have pretty advanced antipsychotic medications. We have community psychiatrists who know what they're doing. What we need to do is ensure that we make that easy to connect with, whether it's ACT teams, community-based hubs like Fountainhouse, which have integrated psychiatry, and the efforts that the potential mayor-elect is looking to do to expand supportive housing, behavioral health supportive housing. Those are all key elements at getting people through these acute phases of crisis and stabilization, whether or not they have insight. And so, yeah, I think that's a false choice in my estimation.
Do we have other audience Q&As? Audience questions? Thank you so much for that response.
Yep, absolutely. So this will actually be our last question. After police respond to a crisis, the next step is often that an individual is sent to a local emergency room and then hospitalized. In psychiatric units, doctors typically prescribe medications. When these take effect, usually 2 weeks, patients are discharged. They end up with families ill-equipped to deal, applications for supportive housing that are not readily available, outpatient programs that patients has to get to themselves. There are not programs or places that can accommodate people with severe mental illness. How can we improve the connections between these systems and provide ongoing support to the individual and their family?
I hate to dominate the Q&A, but I can jump in again.
Absolutely.
It's a very good question, and it's just it's an embodiment of our current system, which is episodic. It's focused on acute care, and it's highly transactional. And taking a step back, we have to look at the sort of financial incentives and reimbursement incentives and care incentives that make it so, right? But beyond that, you're raising a very good point. Yes, it can take 1 week, it can take 1 month, it can take 2 months, 3 months to get someone on the right cocktail of psychiatric medications, depending on their particular condition. In psychiatric inpatient settings, that can be done more quickly. But the question is, what is the connection between those settings and community-based resources? And who is doing the accompaniment of people leaving those settings as they make transitions back into the community? Do we have peer community health workers? Do we have linkages to social infrastructure like clubhouses, like Fountainhouse? No, we currently don't. We currently don't invest in those things at scale. I think a lot of what we're trying to build with this on-ramps program at Fountainhouse is a tonic to that failure, and to really deploy our peer workers like Christina, experts, to go meet people where they are so they can say, you know what, I was where you were at some point in my life, right? I experienced what you've just experienced. I was hospitalized X number of times, and it wasn't until I got connected into this community where I felt seen and connected and appreciated for who I am that I was able to then stabilize my life through the core pillars of any stable life: healthcare, housing, and social connection and community, right? We invest a lot in healthcare in the wrong ways. We have not enough supportive housing, though I'm encouraged by efforts in that direction. But do we talk about social isolation? Do we talk about what is the social infrastructure that people need to feel connected to their community? And who are their communities? When people with serious mental illness come together in community, how powerful that can be, not only as a therapy in and of itself, but as a conduit to get back to work, a conduit to achieve their educational goals, to get their disability benefits arranged. I mean, the things we do as a byproduct of social connection are transformative. Unfortunately, our logic model is, well, get people those things first and then they'll be connected. That isn't the experience of people with SMI. It is the extreme isolation and disconnection from society that is the thing that shortens lives and reduces the quality of life. The public health literature is clear. Social isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in chronic forms, right? And so if you're faced with that extreme isolation, doesn't it make sense to break that first before you start chucking people a whole bunch of services and expecting them to just take it up and feel like they're doing better than? I think we have enough experience, lived and otherwise, to say maybe we need to start investing in social infrastructure for people with mental illness. And clubhouses have offered that kind of solution for 70 plus years. It's been right under our nose. We just haven't chosen to make those investments. And I hope that we're moving into a time where we'll do that.
Thank you so much. Those are very thorough answers and such important topics to touch on. Does anyone else want to sort of weigh in at all? I know that we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes, but does anyone else want to weigh in on this issue of sort of the role of, inpatient psychiatric care or anything else that was brought up?
I mean, I can add, personal experience. I helped a friend get into the Bellevue Psych ER who was experiencing a crisis. And this person was transitioning between different homes. So used my address. I still get bills from Bellevue like all the time. And I tried to help this person then access benefits. I took a half a day off of work to figure it all out and was calling the IT person on the portal. I mean, it's a nightmare. And to me, it just feels like, get someone like Christina, get peers to really go through that process from step to step. What is someone going through and completely rewrite it? Because it is, I mean, even just the fact that I was getting bills and, I would hand a stack of envelopes over to this friend whenever I would see them. And that's enough to make someone run away and be scared and not want to walk into any sort of facility again. And so, I just think that we really need to rewrite this. And, we've got experts who are willing and able and can do it. And I just hope that, we can really bring that to the next administration as a way to, really, we hear a lot of talk about upstream. What can we do upstream to kind of to change things? I mean, this is the way to do it. Start from the very beginning when someone's getting out so that you are ensuring that they don't end up, downstream again.
I just want to add one last thought just for the audience and to end with a challenge, because we're up against it. This mental health system is foundationally broken, and it's broken at the federal level. It's broken at the federal level due to absence of rules, absence of definitions of what's good and what's bad, which leads to absence of knowing where the dollar should go, how much of the dollar should go to what kinds of programs. So while we're thinking about these city-based solutions, we can control only so much. When it comes to the mental health workforce, reimbursement, those are, when it comes to how our community-based mental health block grants are dispersed at the state level, when it comes to how our substance use block grants are dispersed at the state level, CCBHC programs, which you can all look up, these are all pretty nascent and frankly free form in nature. And mental health is very much like the Wild West. So anyone can hang their shingle in the community and say, well, I'm the world's best mental health provider, because there's very little in the way of actual accountability. There's very little in the way of actual proof that you're producing and you're not producing, and therefore I'm going to drive investment into those people who are producing good results. And as a primary care provider, we were in that mode 30 years ago. Primary care was the Wild West. And so we need that kind of revolution in standards, in quality at the federal level, at the same time as we're doing city-based innovation and workarounds in the absence of those rules. A lot could change if we had real leadership in Washington as well. And so I want to encourage folks, as they're thinking about what we can do in our laboratory, the biggest laboratory in the country in many ways, to say, well, how is that influenced by the absence of a true mental health systems architecture at the federal level. And just look under the hood, there is no architecture. And so I'm encouraged because with the stimulus, we have the first new infusion of dollars into federal mental health programs that are then getting passed on through states. And of course, the vast majority of city-funded mental health services comes through state pass-through. Federal dollars pass through the state office of mental health. And so we have an influence here. We're the largest, as an aggregate, the city mental health provider in New York State and one of the largest in the country. We have an ability to put pressure on the federal government and to put pressure on the state to create rules, guidelines, standards, and quality to drive the future of our mental health system. Because if we don't acknowledge that it's foundationally broken to start, the things we're doing and talking about today are really band-aids to a much more structural problem.
Can I add to that? So yes, I do agree with Ashwin, everything he said, especially about the accountability, no accountability for mental health service providers. I hope as a solution to that, I hope that we can have a mental health council eventually consisting of 51% peers. So we could be at the table making decisions, helping policymakers make the best decisions for people in the community.
Absolutely. So we're, 5 minutes out. I think that's a great note to end on, talking about how we can actually improve the mental health system to help avoid, putting people in the criminal justice system. And so I know that Dr. Vasan, you shared a lot just now, but if you have any closing remarks, that'd be great.
I just want to thank everyone for the fantastic discussion today. It was so rich and so needed at this time. Part of what else encourages me is that even just think back 4 years ago, 8 years ago, mental health is now becoming a kitchen table political and policy issue in a way that it's never been. Every single, at least Democratic presidential candidate in the last cycle had a mental health platform for the first time in history. And of course, all of our mayoral candidates here in New York had mental health platforms. That represents a real rise in the public awareness and importance of this issue as something that we need to address as a city. And so as we make this transition to a new mayorality, I'm just so glad that we were able to bring together people like Susan, Liz, Eric, and Christina to have such a rich discussion. I want to thank Trinity Church Wall Street for their support and partnership for this event. It was the first of 3 in a series. You can go to fountainhouse.org/MHIT to RSVP for the next event, which will be on housing. I want to thank Carolyn for her moderation and for her stewardship of this conversation. It was fantastic. And, we'll see you October 26th for the next mental health and transition panel called Rethinking Housing. Be well and have a great day.